The room went so quiet I could hear the ice melting in somebody's bourbon glass. "Young lady, are you aware he's married?" My father's voice wasn't loud. That was the frightening part. General Arthur Bennett had spent 40 years commanding men in war zones, briefing presidents, and standing in rooms where a whisper carried more weight than shouting ever could. Across my living room, the young blonde woman sitting beside my husband turned scarlet. Ethan said they were basically separated." "That's interesting," my father replied calmly. My husband went pale. "Sir, I can explain." I stood near the fireplace, gripping the edge of the mantel so hard my wedding ring cut into my skin. Just 20 minutes earlier, I'd been upstairs changing into pearl earrings for what Ethan told me was a small dinner gathering with potential business clients. Then I walked downstairs and found another woman sitting at my dining table drinking wine from my crystal glasses. Not just sitting there comfortably, smiling, like she belonged there. And my husband of 32 years, had the nerve to introduce her as someone important to his future. At 60 years old, I thought I understood humiliation. Marriage teaches you compromises, aging teaches you disappointments. But nothing prepares you for standing in your own home while the man you built a life with parades another woman through your front door like you're already invisible. Especially after everything you sacrificed for him. Especially after all the years you stayed quiet so he could feel important. I should probably tell you that my husband Ethan had no idea who my father really was. That sounds impossible, doesn't it? But it's true. When Ethan met me in 1993, I was teaching history at a small private school outside Alexandria, Virginia. My father had already retired from the Air Force by then. My parents lived quietly on a horse farm in Middleburg. No security detail, no flashy wealth, no newspaper interviews. My father hated attention. He always said real accomplishment didn't need an audience. So Ethan assumed my parents were simply reserved older Virginians with military manners and modest money. I never corrected him. Not because I was ashamed, quite the opposite. I loved that my parents valued simplicity. My mother still clipped grocery coupons despite having more money than most people in our county. My father drove an old Ford pickup and spent Saturday mornings repairing fences himself. That was the world I grew up in. Quiet dignity. Service before appearance. Character before status. Unfortunately, Ethan slowly became a different man. When we were younger, he was warm and ambitious in a charming way. He sold commercial real estate around Northern Virginia and dreamed of building something meaningful. I admired that about him. Back then, he laughed easily. He loved old jazz records and Sunday drives through the Shenandoah Valley. But success changed him little by little. Or maybe it simply revealed who he already was. As the years passed, Ethan became obsessed with appearances. Bigger houses, better clubs, more influential friends. He started measuring human value by job titles and dinner invitations. And lately he'd become fascinated with politics. Especially powerful people. 3 months earlier, he started mentioning Senator Marcus Whitmore constantly. Apparently, Whitmore's daughter worked in nonprofit fundraising and had excellent Washington connections. That daughter was now sitting in my living room wearing a cream-colored dress and looking terrified of my father. Her name was Vanessa. She couldn't have been older than 35. Young enough to still believe charm could rescue her from consequences. Ethan wiped nervous sweat from his forehead. "General Bennett, I never intended for this to become disrespectful." My mother finally spoke from beside the doorway. "Bringing your mistress into your wife's home usually qualifies as disrespectful." Her tone was elegant and composed, which somehow made it worse. My mother, Eleanor Bennett, had mastered the art of polite devastation decades ago. Vanessa stood abruptly clutching her purse. "I think I should leave." "Yes," my mother said immediately. "I believe you should." Vanessa looked at Ethan, probably expecting him to defend her. He didn't. Cowardice ages a man quickly. In those few minutes, Ethan suddenly looked older than his 64 years. His shoulders slumped. His confidence vanished. The polished businessman who spent years lecturing waiters and bragging at country club dinners looked like a frightened teenager caught stealing. Vanessa hurried toward the front door. Before leaving, she glanced at me with genuine embarrassment. Oddly enough, I didn't hate her. Not really. Because standing there looking at Ethan, I realized something painful. This wasn't about Vanessa. There would always have been another Vanessa eventually. Another younger woman to impress. Another audience for his ego. The real betrayal had begun years ago when Ethan stopped valuing the life we built together. The front door closed softly behind her. Silence settled across the room again. My father looked at Ethan steadily. "You threatened my daughter tonight." Ethan blinked quickly. "Sir, You told her not to anger a senator." My father took one slow step forward. "Son, I buried pilots before you finished college. Do not mistake me for a man intimidated by politicians." I almost closed my eyes at that moment because I recognized the voice. Calm, controlled, dangerous. The command voice. I hadn't heard it in years. Ethan swallowed hard. "Claire never told me." "No," my father interrupted. "She didn't. Because unlike some people, our family doesn't treat influence as decoration." My chest tightened unexpectedly. Even now, after walking into this disaster, my father wasn't bragging. He was defending values, defending me. That realization nearly broke me more than Ethan's betrayal. Because suddenly I understood how lonely I'd become inside my marriage. I used to make excuses for Ethan constantly. He's under stress. He didn't mean it that way. He's worried about retirement. But standing there that evening, I finally saw the truth clearly. A good man under pressure becomes tired. A selfish man under pressure reveals himself. My mother crossed the room and touched my arm gently. "Claire, sweetheart, when did you last eat?" Such a small question. Such a mother question. And for some reason, that was what finally cracked me open. I started crying right there beside the fireplace at 60 years old like a heartbroken girl. Not dramatic sobbing. Just exhausted tears. My father's expression softened instantly. Ethan stepped toward me. "Claire." I held up my hand. "No." One word. But it stopped him cold. Because for 32 years I had always eventually softened, always listened, always forgiven. This time was different. I looked directly at my husband. "You didn't just betray me, Ethan," I said quietly. "You humiliated me in my own home." His eyes filled with panic then. Real panic. Not because he suddenly loved me correctly. Because he finally understood he might actually lose me. And deep down, men like Ethan always assume there will be one more chance. He didn't know yet there wouldn't be. I barely slept that night. After my parents left the house, felt unfamiliar like a hotel room after an argument. The grandfather clock in the hallway sounded louder than usual. Every creak in the floorboards made my nerves jump. Ethan slept downstairs in his office. Or at least I assumed he tried to. Around 3 in the morning, I walked quietly into the kitchen for tea and found him sitting alone at the table in darkness, staring into an untouched glass of scotch. For a moment he looked old. Not distinguished old, not confident old. Just tired. The kind of tired that settles into a man after he realizes the story he told himself about his life is collapsing. He looked up when I entered. "Claire." I said nothing and reached for the kettle. "I'm sorry," he said softly. I kept my eyes on the stove. For which part? The silence after that question stretched painfully. For all of it. I laughed once under my breath. Not because anything was funny, but because men often discover sincerity only after consequences arrive. 32 years of marriage teaches you how to hear the difference between guilt and regret. Guilt says I hurt you. Regret says I got caught. I still didn't know which one Ethan felt. He rubbed both hands over his face. "You have every right to hate me." "I don't hate you." That surprised both of us. Because it was true. Hatred requires energy. What I felt was something colder, a deep disappointment that hollowed me out from the inside. I poured hot water into my mug carefully. "You know what hurts most?" I asked quietly. Ethan looked up. "You thought I'd tolerate it." His jaw tightened. "You honestly believed you could bring another woman into this house and I'd stay quiet because her father was powerful." "Claire, that's not." That is exactly what happened. For years, Ethan had slowly mistaken my calmness for weakness. That realization hurt worse than the affair itself. When we were younger, Ethan used to admire my steadiness. He'd tell friends I could stay calm through anything. During hard years, his business failures in the early 2000s, my mother's cancer, scare the death of his older brother, I was the one who held our life together quietly. But somewhere along the line, my steadiness stopped looking like strength to him. It started looking like surrender. "I never meant to humiliate you," he whispered. I turned toward him finally. "Well, you did. Simple truth sounds heavier after midnight." He looked down again. "You don't understand how things got out of hand." I almost answered sharply. Instead, I sat across from him with my tea between my hands. "No," I said calmly, "I think I finally do." Outside the kitchen window, rain tapped softly against the glass. Northern Virginia rain in late October always carried a certain loneliness with it. Ethan stared toward the dark backyard. I felt invisible. There it was. Not love. Not passion. Vanity. "I'm 64 years old," he continued quietly. "Young people in this business look right through me now. New money, tech people, political donors, everyone chasing the next thing." I listened without interrupting. Then Vanessa started paying attention to me, laughing at my stories, asking for advice. His voice cracked slightly. She made me feel important again. That sentence told me everything. Not because it excused him, because it exposed him. I remembered the man I married at 31. Ethan had once been kind to everyone. He volunteered coaching Little League. He visited his mother every Sunday after church. He used to bring me daisies from roadside flower stands because he remembered I loved simple things. But over time, Ethan became addicted to admiration. And admiration is a dangerous drug for aging people, especially in America where growing older often makes people feel discarded. I softened slightly despite myself. Not enough to forgive him, but enough to understand him. And understanding someone after they hurt you can feel almost cruel. "You should have talked to me," I said quietly. "I know. But instead you chose humiliation." His eyes filled with shame. "I didn't think you'd ever leave." That sentence landed harder than the affair. Because it was true. Ethan had spent decades believing my loyalty was unconditional. And maybe I had taught him that. Not intentionally, but still. Women of my generation were raised differently. We were taught marriage required endurance, patience, sacrifice, quietness. Especially military daughters like me. My mother endured long deployments without complaint. She moved across countries repeatedly. She raised children alone during dangerous years while my father served overseas. Strength in our world looked quiet. Maybe too quiet sometimes. "I need some space," I finally said. Ethan nodded immediately, of course. "I mean real space." His face tightened. "You're leaving." "No, you are." He stared at me like the idea had genuinely never occurred to him. This was my house too, my kitchen, my life. And for the first time in decades, I felt the weight of my own dignity returning slowly to my spine. The next morning, Ethan packed 2 suitcases. Watching your husband fold sweaters into luggage after 32 years together feels surreal. Ordinary objects suddenly become evidence of failure. He paused at the bedroom doorway before leaving. "Claire, did you really never tell me about your family because you didn't care about status?" I looked up from the bed where I sat holding one of our old wedding albums. "Yes." His eyes searched mine. "I don't understand that." "I know." That was the tragedy of it. My father used to say character reveals itself most clearly through what people cannot understand. Ethan couldn't understand why power wasn't the center of our lives, which meant he never truly understood me either. After he left, the silence inside the house became enormous. I wandered room to room touching furniture, photographs, bookshelves. 32 years of marriage lived inside those walls. Family vacations. Christmas mornings. Dinner parties. Arguments. Recoveries. Promises. I stopped in front of our wedding portrait hanging in the hallway. We looked so young. So certain. For a brief moment, grief hit me so hard I had to sit down. Not grief for the man standing in my living room yesterday. Grief for the man I thought he used to be. Around noon, my mother arrived carrying homemade soup because of course she did. Mothers from her generation always brought food to heartbreak. She found me sitting at the dining table still wearing the same sweater from the night before. Without a word, she placed the soup on the stove and sat beside me. Then she took my hand. And I cried again. Quietly this time. "I feel foolish," I whispered. My mother squeezed my fingers gently. "Claire Bennett," she said softly, "there is nothing foolish about loving someone fully." That sentence stayed with me. Because older women carry enough shame already. Shame about aging, about staying too long, about trusting too much. But maybe love itself was never the shameful part. Maybe betrayal belonged entirely to the betrayer. That afternoon my father called. "I've arranged for an attorney to meet with you whenever you're ready." I closed my eyes briefly. Dad believed in preparation, always. "You already knew this might happen, didn't you?" A pause. Then he answered honestly. "I knew Ethan was becoming the kind of man who valued appearances too much." That hurt because deep down I'd known it too. I just kept hoping love would correct it. But love doesn't change character. It only reveals it over time. 3 days after Ethan moved out, I met with the divorce attorney my father recommended. Her office sat in an old red brick building near Georgetown, elegant without trying too hard. The kind of place with polished wood floors, framed law degrees, and a receptionist who spoke softly enough to make everyone else lower their voices too. Her name was Diane Mercer. Late 60s, silver bob haircut, pearl earrings. Competence radiated off her like heat. "I knew your father years ago," she said as she poured coffee into thin white china cups, back when Washington still had adults in the room. That made me smile for the first time in days. Diane opened a thick folder in front of her. "Before we discuss strategy," she said carefully, "I need to ask you something important." I nodded. "Do you want revenge or do you want peace?" The question startled me. Because up until then I thought they were the same thing. I looked out the window toward the gray Potomac River below. "I don't know yet." Diane gave a slow understanding nod. "That's honest. Honest is good." Then she slid several financial documents across the desk toward me. I stared at them in confusion. "These are Ethan's business accounts," she explained, "and these are yours." Mine were significantly larger. I blinked several times. Even though I understood my family's financial structure generally, I had never focused much on the numbers. My father handled most investments through family trusts, established long before I was born. Diane adjusted her glasses. "Claire, do you realize your husband's company would have failed nearly 12 years ago without distributions from your personal trust?" I looked up sharply. "What?" She pointed calmly to several documents. Capital injections, quiet debt coverage, tax protections. Most of Ethan's major business recoveries were indirectly supported by your family assets. I stared at the papers in disbelief. Not because I doubted her. Because I suddenly understood something humiliating. Ethan had spent years acting superior while unknowingly surviving because of me. Or more accurately, because of the quiet stability my family provided. I never even told him, I murmured. Diane folded her hands carefully. "Your father requested discretion." That sounded exactly like him. No performance. No reminders. No making a man feel small. The Bennetts believed helping family quietly was part of responsibility. Unfortunately, some people mistake silent support for weakness. Diane studied me for a moment. "You still love him." It wasn't a question. And against all logic, tears burned my eyes again. Yes. That was the terrible part. Love doesn't disappear simply because trust does. People my age understand that better than younger generations sometimes do. After 32 years, a marriage becomes stitched into your nervous system. You don't just lose a spouse. You lose routines, shared language, history. You lose the witness to your life. Diane handed me a tissue gently. "You can love someone and still leave them." I nodded slowly. That afternoon I drove aimlessly through Northern Virginia for nearly 2 hours. Past old churches, shopping centers, quiet suburban neighborhoods where Halloween decorations already sat on porches. Ordinary American life continued around me as if my world hadn't cracked open. I finally parked outside a small diner near Fairfax where Ethan and I used to eat breakfast after church on Sundays years ago. The waitress recognized me immediately. "Haven't seen you two in forever." The sentence hit harder than she intended. I forced a smile and ordered coffee. Sitting there alone in the booth, I found myself remembering the early years of our marriage before ambition hardened Ethan into someone restless and dissatisfied. Back then, we didn't have much money. Our first apartment had thin walls and unreliable heat. Ethan drove a used Buick with a door that only opened from the outside. We spent summers drinking cheap wine on the balcony while listening to baseball games on the radio. And we were happy. Or at least I thought we were. I remembered helping Ethan practice presentations late at night when he first entered commercial real estate. I edited proposals, balanced budgets, encouraged him after failed deals. When his first company nearly collapsed in 2008, he sat at our kitchen table crying quietly because he thought he'd failed me. I held his hand and said, "We'll survive." And we did. Because my father quietly arranged financial protections without Ethan ever knowing. Not to deceive him. To preserve his pride. I stared down into my coffee. The saddest part wasn't that Ethan never appreciated my family's help. The saddest part was that he never valued the woman standing beside him enough to notice her strength. That evening, my parents invited me to their farm for dinner. The Bennett farm sat outside Middleburg, surrounded by rolling fields, white fences, and old maple trees just beginning to turn gold with autumn. My father bought the property after retirement because he said, after decades of war rooms and military bases, he wanted silence. Real silence. Not Washington silence. As I pulled into the driveway, my father stood near the barn repairing a fence post himself, despite being 72 years old. Some men retire into golf memberships. My father retired into work boots. He waved as I approached. "How'd the meeting go?" "Expensive," I answered dryly. That earned a laugh. We walked slowly together toward the house. "You know," Dad said after a moment, "when I first met Ethan, I liked him." "I know. He loved you sincerely once." The ache in my chest returned immediately. "I think so too." Dad stopped walking. "Claire, people aren't only one thing. A man can love his wife and still become selfish." I looked at him carefully. "Is that supposed to make me feel better?" "No," he gave a tired smile, "just accurate." That was another thing about my father. Military command had stripped him of simplistic thinking decades ago. Life wasn't divided neatly into heroes and villains. Weakness and loneliness could corrupt people slowly over time. Inside the farmhouse, my mother made pot roast and fresh biscuits. The house smelled like rosemary and butter and wood smoke. Safe smells. Healing smells. At dinner, they didn't pressure me about the divorce. They didn't criticize Ethan endlessly either. That surprised me. Finally, halfway through dessert, I asked the question sitting heavily inside me. "Why didn't you ever tell Ethan who you really were?" My mother smiled softly. "Because we wanted him to love you for yourself. And if a man values you less because he thinks your family is ordinary," my father added quietly, "then eventually he'll reveal something ugly about himself." I lowered my eyes. He did. Dad reached across the table and squeezed my hand once. "Yes," he said gently, "he did." Later that night, after my parents went to bed, I sat alone on the farmhouse porch, wrapped in one of my mother's quilts. The Virginia countryside stretched dark and peaceful around me. For the first time since the dinner party, I realized something surprising. I wasn't afraid anymore. Heartbroken, yes. Embarrassed sometimes. Angry occasionally. But not afraid. Because somewhere underneath all the grief, I had started remembering who I was before I spent decades shrinking myself to protect a man's ego. And that woman, I realized quietly, was still there. A week later, I found myself standing beside my father at Arlington National Cemetery. The wind carried that particular October chill unique to Virginia, sharp enough to make you pull your coat tighter, gentle enough to remind you winter hadn't fully arrived yet. Rows of white headstones stretched across the hills in perfect order. Every time I came there, the silence humbled me. Not empty silence. Earned silence. My father walked slowly beside me with his hands folded behind his back. Even retired for nearly 15 years, he still moved like a military officer, measured, alert, disciplined. We stopped near the gravesite of one of his closest friends, a pilot he'd served with decades earlier. Dad crouched carefully despite his stiff knees and brushed a few fallen leaves from the headstone. "He never got to grow old," he said quietly. That sentence settled heavily between us. At 60, I'd started noticing how often conversations among older Americans turned toward time, retirement, illness, grandchildren, loss. We spend so much of youth imagining life ahead that eventually it shocks us to realize more years sit behind us than in front. Maybe that's why Ethan panicked. Not because he was evil. Because aging frightened him. Unfortunately, fear can make selfish people dangerous. "You still thinking about him?" my father asked gently as we continued walking. "Yes." "That's normal." I gave him a sideways glance. You're remarkably calm about all this. Dad smiled faintly. Claire, I spent 40 years watching human beings make mistakes under pressure. Mistresses aren't exactly battlefield decisions. No, he admitted, but pride is pride, ego is ego. We walked quietly for a few moments. Then Dad stopped near a large oak tree overlooking the cemetery hills. You know what war teaches you eventually. I shook my head. Nobody is impressive forever. The breeze rustled through the branches above us. Titles disappear, he continued softly. Uniforms disappear, beauty disappears, strength fades. Character is what stays behind. I felt tears sting unexpectedly. Because deep down, I knew that was exactly what Ethan had lost sight of. And maybe what I had forgotten too. That afternoon, I drove to the Veterans Hospital in Washington for the first time in years. My mother volunteered there every Thursday, helping elderly spouses complete paperwork and insurance forms. After retirement, my father occasionally visited wounded veterans quietly without publicity. I used to help during holidays when life was less busy. Before my marriage became maintenance instead of partnership. The hospital smelled faintly of coffee disinfectant and old linoleum floors. Familiar somehow, honest. My mother greeted me warmly near the volunteer office. Oh good, she said immediately. Mrs. Talbot's hearing aid paperwork has become a nightmare. You're better at forms than I am. That made me laugh softly. And strangely, laughter felt unfamiliar now. Like using muscles I hadn't stretched in years. For the next few hours, I sat with elderly veterans and their families helping sort documents, insurance claims, transportation requests. Ordinary problems. Real problems. One man named Frank kept calling me young lady despite being only 15 years older than me. Another veteran showed me photographs of his grandchildren for 20 straight minutes while forgetting my name entirely. And somehow being around those people soothed something inside me. No performance. No social climbing. No pretending. Just human beings trying to carry life with dignity. Around 3 o'clock, a woman named Margaret sat beside me in the cafeteria. She looked to be in her 70s, sharp-eyed with short gray curls and a denim jacket covered in volunteer pins. You're Arthur Bennett's daughter, she said immediately. I nodded. He helped my husband years ago. Really? Margaret smiled warmly. My Harold came home from Vietnam carrying more ghosts than luggage. Your father got him into counseling before anybody else would admit veterans needed it. Emotion tightened unexpectedly in my throat. My father rarely talked about those years. Margaret stirred cream into her coffee slowly. Good men don't advertise kindness, she said. That's how you know it's real. I thought about Ethan instantly. About expensive dinners, loud networking events, constant conversations about influence and visibility. Somewhere along the line he'd confused attention with importance. Margaret tilted her head carefully. You look heartbroken. Older people stop pretending not to notice pain. I smiled sadly, that obvious. Honey, I'm 76, nothing subtle anymore. That made me laugh again. Then somehow I found myself telling her pieces of the story. Not every humiliating detail. Just enough. Margaret listened quietly without interrupting. Finally, she patted my hand. Men panic when they age, she said matter-of-factly. Some buy Corvettes, some chase younger women, some become grumpy old fools. And some grow wiser. I looked down at my coffee. I'm not sure Ethan will. Margaret shrugged gently. That's his tragedy, not yours. That sentence followed me home. 2 days later, Ethan called unexpectedly. I almost didn't answer. But after 32 years, ignoring his name on my phone felt impossible. Hello? His voice sounded tired immediately. Claire, thank you for not destroying me publicly. I frowned slightly. I never wanted to destroy you. A long pause. I think that somehow makes this worse. I leaned back slowly in my chair. How's the apartment? Small. That nearly made me smile despite myself. Ethan had always hated small spaces. He cleared his throat awkwardly. I lost the Franklin contract. I closed my eyes briefly. The Franklin contract was huge, nearly 40% of his consulting income. I'm sorry, I said automatically. And I meant it. That surprised me. Ethan let out a hollow laugh. You know what's pathetic? Half the people avoiding me now were never real friends to begin with. There it was. The loneliness underneath vanity. I didn't answer immediately. Finally, I said quietly, "That's what happens when relationships are built on appearances." Silence. Then softly, "You warned me about that years ago." I remembered the conversation instantly. A charity gala in Georgetown nearly 12 years earlier. Ethan spent the entire evening chasing conversations with influential donors while ignoring longtime friends seated beside us. On the drive home, I told him, people who only value status eventually abandon each other the moment status disappears. At the time, he laughed it off. Now he sounded broken remembering it. "Claire," he said carefully, "did you ever feel invisible with me?" The question stunned me, because he had never asked anything like that before. And the truthful answer hurt. Yes. Silence filled the line again. Not defensive silence, painful silence. The kind older couples eventually recognize the silence that arrives when truth finally outweighs pride. When we hung up, I sat quietly for a long time staring out my living room window. Marriage is strange that way. Sometimes people don't really begin seeing each other clearly until everything falls apart. That evening, my mother called and invited me for Sunday dinner again. Before hanging up, she added gently, "Your father's making chili. Try to act impressed." I smiled to myself afterward. And for the first time in weeks, the future didn't feel entirely dark. Not healed. Not settled. But survivable. At our age, sometimes hope arrives quietly. Not as excitement. As peace. By early December, Ethan's business had officially begun to collapse. Not dramatically. That's the thing younger people misunderstand about failure. Most lives don't explode overnight. They erode quietly. One canceled contract. One unanswered phone call. One invitation that suddenly stops arriving. At our age, you notice those absences immediately. Ethan certainly did. I heard pieces of the story through mutual friends first. A developer in McLean ended their consulting agreement. 2 longtime clients moved to another firm. A charity board quietly replaced him before the annual gala. Washington has always specialized in elegant exile. Nobody says you're unwelcome. They simply stop calling. I wish I could tell you I enjoyed hearing about it. Part of me expected revenge to feel satisfying, but mostly it felt sad. 32 years is a long time to watch someone slowly become a stranger. One rainy afternoon, Ethan came by the house to collect more belongings. I nearly didn't open the door when I saw him standing there through the window. He looked thinner. His expensive camel overcoat hung loosely around his shoulders, and for the first time in decades, his hair looked genuinely gray instead of carefully managed. Aging arrives quickly once vanity loses its audience. "Hi," he said awkwardly when I opened the door. "Hello?" For a moment, neither of us moved. Then I stepped aside silently. He walked into the foyer slowly, like a visitor instead of a husband. The Christmas decorations were already up. Garland along the staircase. White lights around the mantel. The same decorations I'd unpacked every December since 1994. Ethan stared at them quietly. "You always made Christmas beautiful." The comment hit me unexpectedly hard. Because it was true. For decades, I created warmth around him while he chased admiration elsewhere. He walked upstairs while I remained in the kitchen pretending to organize mail. A few minutes later, I heard drawers opening in the bedroom. Then silence. Then another drawer. 32 years of shared life reduced to deciding which sweaters belonged to whom. Eventually, he came downstairs carrying 2 boxes. He paused near the dining room doorway. "Do you remember our first Christmas here?" Of course I remembered. We bought the house in 1998 after years of saving. It wasn't enormous by Washington standards, but I loved it immediately. Wide front porch, tall windows, old oak trees in the backyard. That first Christmas, we couldn't afford proper furniture yet, so we ate dinner sitting on folding chairs beside the fireplace. "Yes," I answered quietly. Ethan gave a tired smile. "You made tomato soup because we spent all our money on the down payment. And you burned the grilled cheese sandwiches." "That too." For one painful second, the old version of us returned. Not the polished couple from charity galas. Just 2 people trying to build a life together. Then reality settled back into the room again. Ethan looked down. "I threw away something good, didn't I?" I answered honestly. "Yes." His eyes closed briefly. I keep thinking if I explain myself correctly, maybe this will make sense somehow. It won't. He nodded slowly like he already knew that. Then he looked at me carefully. Do you hate her? Vanessa. He nodded. I surprised myself by answering immediately. No. That seemed to genuinely confuse him. She knew you were married, he said quietly. Yes, but she didn't stand before me 32 years ago and promise loyalty. That landed hard. Ethan looked away toward the Christmas tree blinking softly in the corner. I don't think I understood what loyalty cost you. The sentence settled heavily between us. Because women of my generation understand loyalty differently than many younger people do. We stayed through layoffs, illness, aging parents, financial strain, exhaustion, quiet disappointments. We kept marriages alive through ordinary endurance. Not because we were weak, because we believed commitment mattered. And maybe sometimes we tolerated too much because of it. I wasn't unhappy all those years, Ethan said suddenly. I looked at him. That almost makes this worse. His face crumpled slightly. I know. Before leaving, he hesitated near the front door. The apartment feels empty. I folded my arms gently. That's what consequences feel like sometimes. He nodded once and walked out into the rain carrying his boxes. I watched from the doorway until his car disappeared down the street. Then I closed the door and stood there crying quietly where he couldn't see me. Not because I wanted him back. Because grief doesn't disappear simply because betrayal exists. A week later, I finalized preliminary divorce agreements with Diane Mercer. We sat together in her office reviewing financial settlements. You're being extremely generous, Diane observed carefully. I don't need to punish him financially. She studied me over her glasses. You could. I know. And I could have. Legally, much of Ethan's lifestyle had depended indirectly on structures connected to my family's trusts and investments. But stripping him completely felt cruel. My father was surprised when I told him my decision later that evening. You owe him nothing, he said firmly. Maybe not. Dad looked at me carefully across the farmhouse kitchen table. Then why? I stared down at my coffee for a long moment before answering. Because I loved him once. The room grew quiet. My mother reached over and touched my hand softly. Mercy becomes easier once anger finishes burning. That doesn't mean forgiveness arrives quickly. Only that revenge eventually grows exhausting. A few days before Christmas, Ethan called again. This time his voice sounded different. Smaller somehow. I lost the apartment. I sat upright immediately. What happened? I can't afford it anymore. The words seemed painful for him to say aloud. A man who spent years projecting success now admitting financial instability. I found a smaller place in Arlington, he added quickly. It's temporary. I leaned back slowly. Do you need help moving? The question slipped out before I could stop it. Long silence. Then very quietly. Why are you still kind to me? I looked out the window toward falling snow beginning to cover the backyard. Because despite everything, kindness still felt more natural to me than cruelty. Because being cruel won't heal me, I answered honestly. He made a sound that almost resembled breaking. That Christmas Eve, I spent the evening at my parents' farmhouse. The house glowed warmly against the cold Virginia night. My mother baked pecan pie while old Nat King Cole records played softly in the background. My father fell asleep in his armchair halfway through a football game. Ordinary things. Comforting things. At one point, I stood alone by the window watching snow drift across the fields. And suddenly I realized something important. For months I'd been thinking of my life as something destroyed. But maybe it wasn't destroyed. Maybe it was simply changing shape. Painfully. Unexpectedly. But not hopelessly. At 60 years old, that realization felt strangely liberating. Because there's still life after heartbreak. Still purpose after disappointment. Still peace waiting somewhere beyond humiliation. You just have to survive long enough to reach it. By February, the sharpest part of winter had settled over Virginia. The trees outside my bedroom window stood bare and skeletal against pale morning skies, and the quiet after snowfall seemed to soften everything, even grief. I had moved into a smaller home by then. Not because I needed to financially. Because I wanted simplicity. After Ethan left, the old house began feeling too large for one person. Too full of echoes. Every hallway carried memories I wasn't ready to trip over daily. So I bought a modest historic cottage near Middleburg, only 15 minutes from my parents' farm. White shutters, stone walkway, small library room with built-in shelves I immediately loved. For the first time in years, the house belonged entirely to me. No entertaining schedules, no business dinners, no pretending. Just peace. Most mornings I drank coffee beside the kitchen window while watching birds gather near the feeder outside. It sounds small, but after decades of tension, I'd barely acknowledged quiet became a kind of medicine. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, I volunteered at the Veterans Center with my mother. That's where I met Daniel Harper. The first thing I noticed about Daniel was his voice. Calm voices matter when you get older. He spoke slowly, thoughtfully, without the exhausting performance so many people carry now. A retired Navy physician in his late 60s, Daniel volunteered twice a week helping elderly veterans navigate medical paperwork and transportation issues. The second thing I noticed was that he listened fully when people spoke. That quality has become rare. We met over a broken coffee machine in the volunteer lounge. "It only works if you threaten it first," he told me solemnly while smacking the side lightly. To my surprise, the machine sputtered back to life immediately. I laughed. Years of medical training. Navy medicine, he corrected. We learned improvisation. His smile was warm but unassuming. No flashy charm. No effort to impress. And after everything with Ethan, that steadiness felt unexpectedly comforting. Over the following weeks, Daniel and I developed an easy friendship. We ate lunch together sometimes in the hospital cafeteria, talking mostly about ordinary things. Books. Music. Adult children leaving home. The strange invisibility that comes with aging in America. Daniel had been widowed 6 years earlier after nearly 40 years of marriage. She hated hospitals, he told me once with amused sadness, which was inconvenient considering she married a doctor. I smiled softly. "Were you happy?" "With her?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, not every day, but overall yes." That answer stayed with me because it sounded honest. Not romanticized. Real. Older people understand happiness differently. We stop expecting constant excitement. We begin valuing consistency, safety, companionship. Peace becomes more attractive than passion eventually. One afternoon after volunteering, Daniel and I walked slowly through downtown Middleburg, carrying cups of coffee while snow melted along the sidewalks. "You seem lighter lately," he observed gently. I looked at him carefully. "I think I'm finally breathing normally again." He nodded like he understood exactly what I meant. "Long marriages can become heavy," he said quietly, "even good ones." I appreciated that he didn't immediately criticize Ethan. Most people wanted villains and victims because simple stories feel easier to process. But real marriages rarely collapse from one moment alone. Sometimes they erode slowly under unspoken disappointments. Meanwhile, Ethan had started seeing a therapist. I learned that accidentally during one of our occasional phone calls regarding financial paperwork. I almost walked out after 10 minutes, he admitted awkwardly. I nearly smiled imagining it. Ethan hated vulnerability. What changed your mind? The line stayed quiet briefly. The therapist asked me why I needed strangers to admire me so badly. That sounded uncomfortably accurate. And apparently the answer takes 50-minute sessions to explain. For the first time in months, I heard genuine self-awareness in his voice. Not excuses. Not blame. Reflection. Healing often begins with humiliation, unfortunately. Especially for proud people. Around that same time, Ethan reconnected with his younger brother Michael after nearly 7 years of estrangement. The brothers stopped speaking over something ridiculous involving inheritance disagreements after Ethan's mother died. Pride destroys families in slow motion. One Sunday evening, Ethan called unexpectedly while I cooked soup in my small kitchen. I had dinner with Michael. I stirred the pot slowly. How'd it go? He hugged me. Emotion cracked unexpectedly in his voice. We haven't hugged since Dad's funeral. I leaned quietly against the counter. He said something interesting. What? He said I spent years chasing people who didn't care about me while ignoring the ones who did. The truth sounded painful even secondhand. Outside my kitchen window, snow began falling softly again. I think he's right, Ethan whispered. That conversation haunted me afterward. Because despite everything, part of me still mourned for the man Ethan could have remained if he'd valued the right things. A few days later, my father came by the cottage carrying groceries I didn't ask for because retired military fathers apparently express love through unnecessary supplies. "You living entirely on soup now?" he asked suspiciously while unpacking canned goods. "I'm 60, not 23. Your cooking habits suggest otherwise." I laughed and handed him coffee. Dad wandered slowly through the cottage approvingly. "This place suits you." "I think so too." He stopped beside the bookshelf in the living room. "You seem peaceful." The observation surprised me because it was true. Not fully healed, but steadier. "I spent years shrinking parts of myself without realizing it," I admitted quietly. Dad nodded once. "That happens in marriages sometimes." I kept protecting Ethan's ego. "And who protected yours?" The question hit deep. Because I genuinely didn't know. Women of my generation were often taught emotional caretaking so thoroughly that eventually we stopped noticing our own exhaustion. Dad sat heavily in the armchair near the window. "You know why your mother and I survived all these years?" I smiled faintly, fear. "That too." Then his expression softened warmly. "But mostly because neither of us needed the world to constantly prove our value." That was the difference. My parents built their marriage around partnership. Ethan built much of his identity around validation. And validation disappears quickly with age. That evening after Dad left, I sat quietly by the fireplace thinking about the strange shape life had taken. 6 months earlier, I believed my marriage defined me completely. Now I was learning something unexpected. There could still be joy after betrayal. Still friendship. Still meaning. Still mornings filled with peace instead of anxiety. At 60 years old, I had assumed most major transformations were behind me. Instead, life quietly handed me another beginning. And for the first time in a very long while, I wasn't afraid of the future anymore. 1 year after Ethan brought Vanessa into my home, autumn returned to Virginia. The maple trees around Middleburg had turned deep shades of gold and rust again, and cool air drifted through open windows carrying the smell of wood smoke and fallen leaves. I used to think heartbreak permanently divided life into before and after. Now I understood something gentler. Life keeps moving. Not because pain disappears, because people learn how to carry it differently. That October evening, I attended a military charity fundraiser in Washington, honoring veterans and long-term military spouses. My mother convinced me to go after 3 days of persistent encouragement, and one particularly effective guilt trip involving her homemade lemon cake. Daniel attended with me. Not as some dramatic late-life romance. Just quietly. Comfortably. That mattered more. At our age, companionship becomes less about fireworks and more about ease. Daniel never tried to rescue me from my sadness or compete with my memories. He simply showed up consistently, which I had come to realize was one of the purest forms of love. The ballroom overlooked the Potomac River, glowing softly beneath crystal chandeliers and muted conversations. Retired officers, diplomats, widows, volunteers, and old military families filled the room. Familiar worlds. Steady worlds. Daniel handed me a glass of sparkling water. "You nervous?" "A little." "You'll survive." That sounds medically reassuring. Navy medicine specialized in confidence over certainty. I laughed softly. Then I saw Ethan standing near the far side of the ballroom. For one suspended moment, everything inside me went still. He looked older. Not ruined. Just humbled. His hair had gone almost entirely gray now, and the sharp arrogance he once carried so naturally had disappeared. Instead, he stood quietly speaking with an elderly veteran in a wheelchair. Listening carefully. Actually listening. Daniel noticed my expression immediately. "That him?" "Yes." He nodded gently. "You want to leave?" I considered it honestly, then shook my head. "No." Because healing eventually means reclaiming spaces that once hurt you, not avoiding them forever. About 20 minutes later, Ethan approached carefully. "Claire." "Hello, Ethan." His eyes shifted politely toward Daniel. "Good evening." Daniel extended his hand immediately. "Daniel Harper." "Ethan Collins." The men shook hands calmly. No hostility. No territorial tension. Just two older men understanding life had already humbled both of them in different ways. "I'll go rescue your mother from political conversations," Daniel told me quietly before stepping away. God, I appreciated that man. Ethan watched him go. "He seems kind." "He is." For a moment we stood together awkwardly beside the ballroom windows overlooking the river. Then Ethan exhaled slowly. "I almost didn't come tonight." "Why did you?" He looked down briefly. "I volunteer with a veterans housing program now. They invited me." I nodded softly. I heard. Over the past several months, Ethan had begun working with struggling veterans through a community outreach organization. At first, I assumed guilt drove him there. Maybe it did. But sometimes people begin changing for imperfect reasons and still become better. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. I folded my hands together patiently. A real one this time. The honesty in that sentence immediately caught my attention. No excuses. No self-pity. Just accountability. Ethan swallowed hard. "What I did to you was cruel, not just selfish. Cruel." Emotion flickered across his face. I humiliated the person who loved me most because I was terrified of getting older and becoming irrelevant. I stayed silent. Not to punish him. To let him continue. I spent years needing strangers to admire me because somewhere along the line I stopped respecting myself. His voice lowered further. "And instead of facing that, honestly, I hurt you." There it was. The truth at last. Simple. Uncomfortable. Real. The ballroom noise softened around us as if distance suddenly separated us from everyone else. "I don't expect forgiveness," he added quickly. I looked at him carefully then. Really looked. And for the first time in years I saw no performance left in him. Just an aging man finally confronting himself honestly. Something inside me loosened quietly. Not romantic love? That chapter had ended. But bitterness. The heavy bitterness I'd carried for so long. "I forgive you," I said softly. His eyes filled immediately. Not dramatic tears. Just grief. Relief. Humility. "Thank you," he whispered. I surprised myself by smiling faintly. "Forgiveness isn't permission, Ethan." "I know. It's just freedom." He nodded slowly like someone memorizing the sentence. A few minutes later my father approached us. Even retired generals remain impossible to ignore in crowded rooms. Dad still carried authority naturally despite his age and stiffening knees. Ethan straightened immediately out of instinct. Dad studied him quietly for several seconds. Then he spoke. "A man is measured by what he does after failure." Simple words. But my father always preferred truth without decoration. Ethan nodded carefully. "I'm trying, sir." Dad's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "That matters." And just like that, the war between them quietly ended. Not through dramatic reconciliation. Through maturity. Through time. Through acceptance that flawed people can still choose dignity afterward. Later that evening, Daniel drove me home through dark Virginia roads lined with glowing porch lights and autumn trees. "You okay?" he asked gently. I looked out the passenger window for a moment before answering. Yes. And I meant it. For the first time since my marriage collapsed, the story no longer felt unfinished. A week later, my parents invited everyone to the farmhouse for Sunday dinner. Not Ethan. Just family. My mother made roast chicken while my father complained about football rankings with the seriousness of international diplomacy. Daniel helped me wash dishes afterward while jazz music played softly through the kitchen. At one point, I glanced through the window toward the porch. My parents sat side by side beneath wool blankets watching the sunset over the fields. Their hands rested together naturally after nearly 50 years of marriage. No performance. No audience. Just loyalty weathered into tenderness over time. And suddenly I understood something that had taken me 60 years to fully learn. Real strength isn't loud. It isn't political influence or money or social status. It's the quiet courage to remain decent in a world constantly tempting people toward selfishness. It's choosing loyalty when nobody applauds for it. It's surviving disappointment without becoming bitter. It's allowing yourself to begin again after humiliation. Even late in life. Especially late in life. So, if you're listening to this story tonight, carrying heartbreak, regret, or disappointment of your own, I hope you remember something important. The people who appear quietest are often carrying the strongest foundations. And sometimes losing the life you expected becomes the first step toward finding peace you never thought possible. If this story touched you in some way, share it with someone who may need the reminder that dignity, kindness, and second chances still matter. And if you'd like more stories about resilience, family, and finding hope later in life, I'd be honored for you to stay a while longer.